The dog was already sitting at the grave before the cemetery gates even opened, and somehow, nobody in the town could explain how it kept getting inside. Every morning at exactly 5:17 a.m., the old golden retriever appeared beside the same cracked headstone at Briar Hill Cemetery, soaked with dew, silent as stone, staring toward the woods behind the graves instead of the grave itself. People had tried following him before. Some said he vanished between the trees. Others swore they saw him sleeping beside the grave long after midnight, even though the cemetery was locked tight with heavy chains. But the strangest part was this. The dog never accepted food from anyone except one person, and nobody knew who that person was. Caleb Dawson first noticed the animal during a thunderstorm while driving through the small town of Ashcroft on his way to Columbus. Rain hammered against his windshield as lightning flashed over the empty cemetery near Route 8, and for one split second, he saw the silhouette of a dog sitting perfectly still between the gravestones. At first, Caleb thought it was a statue. Then the lightning struck again. The dog moved its head slowly toward his truck. Caleb felt a chill crawl up his arms. The animal wasn't scared of the storm. It wasn't trying to find shelter. It was waiting. Something about the way the dog stared made Caleb tap the brakes without thinking. The cemetery should have been empty at that hour. It was nearly midnight. But the dog suddenly stood up and began walking deeper into the graveyard before stopping beside a weathered grave near a dead oak tree. Then it looked back at Caleb again, waiting. Caleb normally ignored strange things on the road. He wasn't the type to chase ghost stories or town rumors. But there was something painfully human in the dog's eyes. Exhausted, nervous, like it had been waiting for someone for a very long time. Against his better judgment, Caleb parked near the gate and stepped into the rain. Mud soaked through his sneakers immediately as thunder rolled above him. The dog didn't run away. It simply watched him approach the grave. The headstone was old and partially cracked down the middle, its letters faded by years of storms and neglect. Caleb could barely read the name carved into the stone, Eleanor Whitmore. 1981 to 2019. No flowers, no candles, no signs anyone had visited in years. Yet beside the grave sat a fresh red carnation untouched by the rain. Caleb frowned. He looked around. The cemetery was completely empty. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, crouching a few feet away. "You belong to someone?" The dog didn't react to his voice. Instead, its ears suddenly lifted toward the woods behind the cemetery. A low sound escaped its throat. Not a growl, more like a warning. Caleb slowly turned his head toward the dark tree line. At first, he saw nothing except sheets of rain moving through the branches. Then lightning flashed again. For less than a second, Caleb could have sworn he saw another person standing between the trees watching them. When the darkness returned, the figure was gone. Caleb's heartbeat spiked. He looked back at the dog. The animal was now backing away from the grave one careful step at a time without taking its eyes off the woods. Then, for the first time that night, the dog let out a single sharp bark and sprinted directly into the darkness between the trees. A second later, Caleb heard something deep in the woods slam shut. Caleb stood frozen in the rain for several seconds after the sound echoed through the woods. It did not sound like a branch breaking or an animal running through the trees. It sounded heavier, metallic, like an old door or gate slamming shut somewhere deep beyond the cemetery. The storm suddenly felt colder around him. He called out softly for the dog, but only thunder answered back. After another moment, Caleb backed away from the tree line and returned to his truck, unable to shake the strange feeling twisting in his stomach. He barely slept that night at the roadside motel outside town. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dog sitting beside the grave with rain dripping from its fur, staring into the darkness like it was waiting for something terrible to come back. By sunrise, Caleb had convinced himself the entire thing was just exhaustion and bad timing. But around 6 in the morning, curiosity dragged him back to Briar Hill Cemetery. The storm had passed, leaving behind wet roads and low fog drifting through the hills. As Caleb pulled into the cemetery entrance, he immediately spotted the dog again. Same grave, same position, sitting completely still beside Eleanor Whitmore's headstone as if the night before had never happened. Caleb slowly stepped out of the truck holding a paper bag from a diner he had stopped at earlier. Bacon, eggs, sausage, and plain toast. The smell filled the cold morning air. The dog did not react. Caleb crouched several feet away and carefully placed pieces of bacon onto the damp grass. "Come on, buddy," he said quietly. "You have got to be hungry." The golden retriever looked toward the food for only a second before turning its attention back toward the woods behind the graves. Caleb frowned. The animal was thin beneath its soaked fur, far thinner than it should have been for a dog that size. Its ribs faintly showed whenever it shifted position. One ear carried an old scar. Its paws were muddy and worn raw around the edges like it had spent years walking rough ground. Yet despite all of that, the dog still sat upright with quiet patience, almost disciplined in a way Caleb could not explain. After several minutes, the dog finally stood. Caleb felt relieved for a second, thinking it would eat. Instead, the retriever carefully picked up the red carnation lying beside the grave and carried it gently toward the woods before disappearing between the trees again. Caleb stared after it in confusion. It had ignored food but taken the flower. An hour later, while speaking with Martha Green, the cemetery caretaker, Caleb learned the town called the dog Rusty. "Nobody owns him anymore," Martha explained softly while trimming dead flowers near another grave. "At least not officially." Martha was nearly 70 and had worked at Briar Hill Cemetery for over 2 decades. She admitted she had been leaving bowls of water near Eleanor Whitmore's grave for years because the dog always returned. "Sometimes he disappears for days," she said, "but he always comes back before sunrise." Caleb asked if Eleanor had been Rusty's owner. Martha hesitated before answering. "That is what people assume." There was something uneasy in the way she said it. Not sadness, fear. Caleb noticed Martha constantly glancing toward the woods while they talked, almost like she expected someone to overhear them. "You should leave this alone," she warned quietly. "This town has spent years trying to forget what happened." Caleb looked back toward Eleanor's grave. Rusty had returned again somehow, silently sitting beside the headstone with muddy paws tucked beneath him. The dog lowered its head against the stone for a moment, almost the way a tired person rests against a window during a long drive. Caleb felt an ache in his chest watching him. Whatever this animal had been waiting for, it clearly was not coming anymore. As Caleb prepared to leave, something near the base of the grave caught his attention. Half buried in the mud beside the headstone was a child's blue rain boot, faded with age and covered in dirt. Caleb slowly bent down to pick it up. Then he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Stitched into the side of the tiny boot in faded black letters was a name, Eleanor. Caleb could not stop thinking about the child's rain boot. The tiny faded shoe stayed in his mind long after he left the cemetery that afternoon. Something about it felt deeply wrong. Eleanor Whitmore had died in 2019 according to the gravestone, yet the boot looked far older than that, weathered almost beyond recognition as if it had been buried for years before someone recently uncovered it. By evening, Caleb found himself driving back toward Briar Hill Cemetery again, without fully understanding why. The fog had returned thicker this time, rolling low across the ground like smoke drifting between the graves. As soon as Caleb parked near the gate, he spotted Rusty pacing in circles beside Eleanor's grave. It was the first time Caleb had seen the dog restless. Usually the old retriever moved with slow, exhausted patience, but now his paws pressed urgently into the mud as he circled the headstone over and over again. Then Caleb noticed something even stranger. Rusty was carrying objects from around the cemetery and placing them carefully beside the grave. Not random. Trash. Specific things. A rusted silver lighter. A broken wristwatch. A faded church bulletin soaked by rain. The dog carried each item gently in his mouth before arranging them in a crooked line beside the headstone, like someone building a collection. Caleb stepped closer in disbelief. "Where are you getting this stuff?" he whispered. Rusty ignored him completely. The retriever suddenly trotted several yards away toward another cluster of graves before lowering his nose to the ground. After sniffing through wet leaves, the dog uncovered an old photograph half buried in the dirt and carefully carried it back to Eleanor's grave. Caleb felt uneasy watching him. The objects looked unrelated, but the dog handled them with alarming purpose. One by one, almost organized. As darkness settled over the cemetery, headlights suddenly appeared near the entrance. A pickup truck pulled beside Caleb's car, and Deputy Nolan Pierce stepped out adjusting his sheriff department jacket against the cold wind. "You again," Nolan muttered after spotting Caleb near the grave. Martha must have called him. Caleb quickly explained what the dog was doing, But the deputy's expression hardened the moment he looked toward Rusty. That animal has been causing problems for years, Nolan said. People think he is harmless until they get too close. Caleb frowned. He has not hurt anyone. Not yet. Nolan pointed toward the strange collection beside the grave. You think this is normal? Caleb looked back at Rusty. The retriever had stopped pacing and was now sitting beside the line of objects with his eyes fixed on the woods again. The dog seemed tense. Listening. Waiting. Nolan lowered his voice. Couple months ago, a teenager followed him into those trees behind the cemetery. Kid came back terrified, saying the dog kept digging at the ground and barking at empty space for almost 20 minutes straight. Caleb glanced uneasily toward the dark woods. Before he could respond, Rusty suddenly stood upright. His entire body stiffened. The fur along his back slowly lifted as a low sound vibrated in his throat. Not aggressive. Warning. Caleb felt the air around them shift. Even Deputy Nolan stopped talking. Then Rusty did something neither man expected. The dog walked directly to Eleanor's grave, lowered his head, and began scraping furiously at the base of the headstone with both front paws. Dirt sprayed across the wet grass as the old retriever dug faster and faster, whining under his breath like he was desperate to reach something buried underneath. Hey, Nolan shouted, stepping forward. Rusty instantly stopped digging. For one silent second, the dog stared directly at the deputy with an expression Caleb could not explain. Fear, recognition, maybe both. Then Rusty turned sharply toward the woods and released the loudest bark Caleb had heard yet before sprinting into the darkness. A moment later, from somewhere deep between the trees, another dog bark answered him. The second bark from the woods vanished almost as quickly as it came, swallowed by the wind moving through the trees. Caleb stared into the darkness, waiting to hear it again, but the forest fell silent. Deputy Nolan immediately grabbed the flashlight from his truck and stepped toward the tree line, his jaw tight with irritation. That is exactly what I have been talking about, he muttered. This dog keeps dragging people into trouble. Caleb followed several feet behind as the deputy swept his flashlight through the woods. Wet branches glistened in the beam, but Rusty was nowhere in sight. After several minutes, Nolan lowered the flashlight with frustration. Enough is enough, he said firmly. Tomorrow I am calling animal control. Caleb looked at him in disbelief. For what? Sitting at a grave? Nolan shook his head. You are not from here, Caleb. You do not understand what this town has dealt with. Back near the cemetery entrance, Martha Green was waiting anxiously beside her golf cart. The old caretaker looked pale when Nolan explained what happened. He barked back? She whispered. Nolan nodded once. Martha immediately looked toward the woods with visible fear spreading across her face. Caleb noticed something strange then. Neither of them seemed surprised that another dog might be out there. They looked disturbed by what it meant. You cannot take Rusty away, Martha suddenly said. That dog has nowhere else to go. Nolan's expression hardened. And what happens when he leads another person into those woods? People are already talking again, Martha. Caleb frowned. Talking about what? Neither of them answered immediately. Finally, Martha spoke quietly without looking at him. This town used to leave flowers at Eleanor's grave every year after she disappeared. Then people stopped coming. Disappeared? Caleb asked. Her gravestone says she died. Martha's face tightened with regret. That is what people were told. Before Caleb could ask another question, headlights rolled slowly past the cemetery gates. Two local women in a sedan slowed down, just enough to stare toward the graveyard before driving away again. Martha sighed heavily. Now they're going to start gossiping all over town again because of that dog. Caleb did not understand why everyone spoke about Rusty like he was a problem instead of an abandoned animal. The old retriever had not attacked anyone. He had not even taken food. Yet every time his name came up, people reacted with discomfort, like they wanted him gone simply because his presence reminded them of something painful. The next morning, Caleb stopped at a diner near Main Street, hoping to learn more. The moment he mentioned Rusty, conversations around him noticeably quieted. A waitress carrying coffee mugs slowed down near his booth. You should stay away from that cemetery dog, she warned softly. People say he keeps digging up things that should stay buried. Another customer overheard and immediately added, that mutt has been creeping around houses lately too. Caleb frowned. Whose houses? Empty ones mostly, the man replied. Just sitting on porches at night, scratching doors like he remembers who used to live there. The diner suddenly felt colder. Caleb tried convincing himself these were just small-town ghost stories, but deep down something about Rusty's behavior no longer felt random. By afternoon, word had spread through Ashcroft that animal control would arrive the following morning. Caleb returned to Briar Hill Cemetery, hoping to find Rusty before anyone else did. He found the old retriever curled tightly beside Eleanor's grave beneath the dead oak tree, exhausted and trembling slightly from the cold. For the first time, the dog looked old, truly old. His breathing came slow and uneven as he rested his head against the cracked stone. Caleb carefully sat several feet away. "They are coming for you tomorrow," he said quietly. Rusty opened his eyes, but did not move. There was no fear in them, only exhaustion. Then Caleb noticed something that made his chest tighten. Tucked beneath Rusty's paw was another object the dog had dragged from somewhere in town overnight. It was a yellowed missing person flyer covered in dirt and rain stains. Across the top was Eleanor Whitmore's smiling face, and stamped across the bottom in faded red letters were the words "Case closed." That night, Caleb could not shake the image of Rusty sleeping beside the grave with the missing person flyer trapped beneath his paw, like something precious he refused to let go of. The faded red words "Case closed" kept replaying in Caleb's mind over and over again. Nothing about this town's story felt finished. By morning, the sky above Ashcroft had turned heavy and gray again, and the entire town seemed quieter than before. Caleb drove back toward Briar Hill Cemetery just after sunrise, expecting to find animal control already there, but the gates remained empty. Rusty, however, was gone. For the first time since Caleb arrived in town, Eleanor Whitmore's grave sat alone beneath the dead oak tree. The absence felt wrong immediately. Caleb stood beside the cracked headstone, studying the muddy ground around it. The old retriever always returned before dawn, according to Martha. Always. Yet this morning there were no fresh paw prints anywhere near the grave. Caleb felt an unexpected knot of worry tighten in his chest. Then he noticed something partially hidden beneath a patch of wet leaves near the base of the headstone. It was a small rectangular library card sealed inside cloudy plastic. Caleb crouched carefully and pulled it free from the mud. Ashcroft Public Library. The card belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. The issue date stamped on the back made Caleb freeze. October 14th, 2021. 2 years after the date. Carved on her gravestone. Caleb stared at the card in confusion. The edges were worn, but the date was still clear enough to read. His pulse quickened. If Eleanor had died in 2019, how could she have checked out library books in 2021? Before Caleb could process the thought further, Martha's golf cart rolled slowly through the cemetery gate. The old caretaker stepped out carrying fresh flowers, but the moment she saw the library card in Caleb's hand, her face drained of color. "Where did you find that?" she asked quietly. Caleb pointed toward the grave. Martha took the card from him carefully, almost nervously, and stared at the date herself. Her hands trembled slightly. "This should not exist," she whispered. Caleb frowned. "You told me people assumed Eleanor died. What really happened?" Martha looked toward the woods behind the cemetery before answering, as though afraid someone might overhear even out there. 7 years ago, Eleanor disappeared during a storm. Her car was found near Miller's Creek with her purse still inside. A few weeks later, the sheriff's office announced they recovered enough evidence to declare her dead. Caleb glanced at the gravestone again. But no body? Martha hesitated too long before finally shaking her head. No, Caleb's stomach tightened. Suddenly, Rusty's behavior no longer felt like grief alone. The objects, the digging, the missing person flyer. The old dog had not been mourning a death. He had been returning to something unfinished. Martha lowered her voice further. Eleanor used to volunteer at the library every Wednesday evening. She loved books more than anything. Caleb looked back at the card again. Then why was this buried beside her grave? Neither of them had an answer. A cold breeze moved through the cemetery, rattling dead branches overhead. Then Martha noticed something else sticking from the mud where Caleb had found the card. She bent slowly and pulled out a thin strip of fabric caught beneath the roots of the oak tree. It looked like part of an old employee apron from the library. Sewn into the corner in faded thread were the initials E.W. Martha's breathing suddenly became uneven. "Oh my God," she whispered. Caleb looked toward the woods instinctively. "Rusty brought these here." Martha nodded slowly. "Not all at once," she said quietly. "Over the years." The realization settled heavily between them. The old retriever had been collecting pieces connected to Eleanor for years, almost like he was trying to rebuild something nobody else wanted to remember. In the distance, the sound of a truck engine echoed from the road leading toward the cemetery gates. Animal control had arrived. Caleb looked at the library card one last time before slipping it carefully into his jacket pocket. Then he turned toward Martha with sudden certainty in his voice. "Before they take that dog away," he said, "I want to know where he has really been going every night." The animal control truck rolled slowly through the cemetery gates just as the first drops of rain began falling again. Caleb immediately scanned the graves for Rusty, but the old retriever was nowhere in sight. Two officers stepped out carrying catch poles and metal crates, while Deputy Nolan spoke quietly with them near the entrance. Martha looked devastated. "If they take him," she whispered, "he will never come back here again." Caleb glanced toward the woods behind Eleanor's grave. Something deep inside him said Rusty was watching everything from out there, waiting. Then suddenly the old retriever appeared at the edge of the tree line. Mud covered his legs and chest, and his breathing looked uneven from running. One of the animal control officers immediately moved toward him, but Rusty did not growl or run away. Instead, the dog looked directly at Caleb and released a sharp bark before disappearing back into the woods. Caleb felt it instantly. The dog was trying to lead him somewhere again. "Wait," Caleb said suddenly. "Do not touch him yet." Nolan frowned. "Caleb, enough already." But before anyone could stop him, Caleb followed Rusty into the trees. Branches scraped against his jacket as he pushed deeper into the woods behind the cemetery. Ahead of him, Rusty kept stopping every few yards to make sure Caleb was still following. The old retriever moved with urgency now, limping slightly but refusing to slow down. After several minutes, Caleb noticed the woods beginning to thin near a narrow creek hidden behind the cemetery hills. Rusty stopped beside an enormous fallen tree covered in moss and started pawing frantically at the wet ground beneath it. Caleb crouched beside him, confused at first. Then he saw it, a small rusted metal hatch partially hidden beneath mud and leaves. His pulse jumped. It looked old, almost forgotten by time itself. Rusty whined softly and scratched at the hatch again. Caleb grabbed a fallen branch and cleared away the dirt until the metal handle became visible. The hatch opened with difficulty, releasing the smell of damp wood and old paper from below. Beneath the tree was a tiny underground storm shelter no larger than a closet. Caleb aimed his flashlight inside and froze. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings about Eleanor Whitmore, missing person flyers, library receipts, old photographs, dates, notes written carefully in black marker. And in the center of the shelter sat a dusty blue backpack. Caleb slowly unzipped it with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes sealed in plastic bags to protect them from moisture. On top of the tapes rested a final envelope with Eleanor's handwriting across the front. "If anything happens to me, give this to the sheriff outside Ashcroft County." Caleb's heart pounded violently as he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter explaining everything. Eleanor had discovered illegal dumping of toxic chemicals near Miller's Creek while volunteering for a local environmental group years earlier. According to the letter, she had gathered proof against several powerful people connected to nearby land deals. She wrote that someone had started following her, watching her house, and threatening her to stay quiet. But the part that made Caleb go cold was the final paragraph. "If you are reading this, Rusty brought you here. He knows this place. He was with me the night I hid these tapes. I prayed someone kind enough would follow him one day." Caleb stared at the letter in complete disbelief. Every strange thing Rusty had done suddenly made horrifying sense. The objects beside the grave were never random. The dog had been gathering pieces connected to Eleanor all these years because he was trying to lead someone to the truth. The grave itself had never been about mourning. It was the only place connected to Eleanor that nobody in town avoided completely. Rusty had been waiting beside it for years, hoping someone would finally understand him. Caleb slowly turned toward the entrance of the shelter. Rusty stood quietly outside in the rain, watching him with exhausted eyes. Not dangerous, not confused, not broken, loyal. The old retriever took one slow step backward, as if trying to leave now that his job was finally done. Caleb felt his throat tighten painfully. Then he noticed something else inside the shelter that made his entire body go still. Mounted carefully beside Eleanor's notes was a recent calendar page from only 3 months earlier, with one sentence written across it in black ink. He still comes back to the cemetery. For several long seconds, Caleb could not move inside the hidden shelter beneath the fallen tree. Rain drummed softly above him, while Rusty remained standing at the entrance watching quietly, his soaked fur trembling from exhaustion. Caleb looked down again at Eleanor's letter, then at the stacks of carefully protected cassette tapes surrounding him. The old retriever had spent years guarding this place alone. Years. Suddenly, every strange thing Caleb had witnessed replayed in his mind with painful clarity. The objects beside the grave were not random scraps. Rusty had been collecting evidence connected to Eleanor's life because nobody else would. The missing person flyer beneath his paw was not an accident. The dog had kept returning to the grave because it was the only place where people still spoke Eleanor's name out loud. Even the strange barking toward the woods finally made sense. Rusty had not been trying to scare people away. He had been trying to lead someone brave enough to follow him. Caleb slowly climbed out of the shelter, holding Eleanor's letter tightly in his hand. The moment he stepped outside, Rusty immediately lowered himself onto the wet ground beside the fallen tree, too weak to remain standing much longer. Caleb's chest tightened painfully at the sight. The old retriever looked relieved now, almost peaceful in a way Caleb had not seen before, like he had finally stopped carrying something too heavy for one animal to bear alone. Back at the cemetery entrance, Deputy Nolan and Martha spotted Caleb emerging from the woods carrying the backpack and tapes. Their expressions changed instantly when they saw the seriousness in his face. Caleb handed Eleanor's letter to Nolan without saying a word. The deputy read silently while rain rolled down his jacket sleeves. Halfway through the page, his breathing slowed. By the end, his hands were visibly shaking. Martha covered her mouth in disbelief. "Oh God," she whispered softly. Nolan looked toward Rusty, standing weakly near the trees, and for the first time since Caleb met him, the deputy's expression completely changed. The suspicion was gone. In its place sat something far heavier. Shame. All these years, Nolan muttered quietly. We thought that dog was disturbed. Martha stared toward Rusty with tears gathering in her eyes. And he was trying to tell us the truth the entire time. One of the animal control officers stepped closer uncertainly. What do you want us to do about the dog? Nobody answered immediately. Rusty slowly limped back toward Eleanor's grave beneath the oak tree, moving more slowly than ever before. Caleb followed a few feet behind him. The old retriever reached the cracked headstone and carefully lowered himself into the wet grass beside it again. Then he placed his chin against the stone with exhausted familiarity. Caleb noticed something heartbreaking then. Rusty was no longer staring toward the woods. For the first time, the dog's eyes stayed fixed only on the grave itself, like he finally believed someone else knew the truth now. Martha suddenly broke down in a way Caleb had not expected. She did not cry loudly. Instead, she walked slowly to Eleanor's grave, carrying the flowers she had brought earlier, and carefully placed them beside Rusty. I stopped leaving flowers years ago because people told me to let it go, she admitted softly. But he never let it go. Nolan removed his sheriff department hat and stood silently in the rain for several moments before kneeling beside Rusty. The old retriever did not pull away when Nolan gently touched his scarred ear. The deputy swallowed hard. I chased you away from this cemetery more times than I can count, he said quietly. And every single time you came back anyway. Caleb watched the old retriever carefully. Rusty's tired eyes slowly closed beneath Nolan's hand, not in fear, but trust. That small gesture hit harder than any apology could have. After everything the town had done, the dog still trusted them enough to stay. Nolan stood up suddenly and turned toward the animal control officers. Nobody is taking this dog anywhere, he said firmly. Then he looked back toward Caleb, gripping Eleanor's letter tightly in his hand. We are reopening the entire case tonight. By sunset, the entire atmosphere around Briar Hill Cemetery had changed. Police vehicles no longer surrounded the place like a threat. Instead, soft yellow work lights illuminated the old graves while investigators carefully carried Eleanor's tapes and documents from the hidden shelter beneath the fallen tree. News spread through Ashcroft faster than anyone expected. For years, the town had spoken about Rusty in whispers, like he was a strange reminder of something people wanted buried forever. But now people arrived quietly at the cemetery carrying flowers, candles, old photographs, and handwritten notes addressed to Eleanor. Some came because they remembered her kindness. Others came because guilt had finally become too heavy to ignore. Through it all, Rusty remained beside the cracked headstone beneath the oak tree. The old retriever barely moved anymore. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him after years of surviving alone, yet every time someone approached Eleanor's grave respectfully, his tense posture softened slightly. Caleb noticed it immediately. Rusty had spent years deciding who could be trusted near that grave, and for the first time, he no longer looked afraid of people standing there. Martha Green arrived carrying something wrapped carefully in a faded blue blanket. She slowly unfolded it beside the grave, revealing a wooden sign she had spent the afternoon repainting by hand. The original cemetery marker for Eleanor had become damaged long ago, but this new one carried fresh lettering beneath Eleanor Whitmore's name. Beloved daughter, volunteer, friend, never forgotten. Martha placed the sign gently into the ground while tears rolled silently down her cheeks. She deserved better than silence, she whispered. One by one, townspeople stepped forward to help clean the neglected gravesite. Someone trimmed dead weeds around the oak tree. Another person repaired the broken stone border surrounding the plot. An older man quietly replaced the rusted flower holder beside the headstone without saying a word to anyone. No speeches, no dramatic apologies. Just people trying to repair something they should have protected years ago. Caleb sat several feet away watching Rusty carefully. The old retriever's eyes followed every movement around the grave. At first, Caleb worried the noise and activity might overwhelm him, but instead the dog seemed strangely calm, almost curious. Then something unexpected happened. A little girl around 8 years old slowly approached the grave carrying a red carnation in both hands. Caleb immediately recognized the flower. Rusty had brought one to the grave himself during the storm the first night Caleb saw him. The little girl knelt carefully beside the headstone and placed the flower near Rusty's paw. Thank you for staying with her, she whispered softly to the dog. Rusty lowered his head toward the flower and gently touched it with his nose. The entire cemetery fell quiet watching the moment. Even Deputy Nolan looked away, wiping at his eyes before anyone could notice. Later that evening, Caleb helped Martha set up a small covered area beside the cemetery office with blankets, food bowls, and a portable heater for Rusty to rest near the grave without sleeping directly in the cold mud anymore. But what touched Caleb most was what happened next. Nobody asked the dog to move there. Nobody forced him. Rusty slowly stood on trembling legs and walked toward the shelter on his own. He paused halfway there and looked back at Eleanor's grave one long final time. Caleb could almost see the hesitation inside him. 7 years of guarding that place alone had become his entire life. Then Martha quietly placed Eleanor's repaired library card inside the warm shelter beside the blankets. Rusty noticed immediately. The old retriever slowly stepped inside, circled once, and carefully lowered himself beside the card. For the first time since Caleb met him, Rusty closed his eyes without listening for danger, without watching the woods, and without lifting his head every few seconds toward the grave. Outside, rain began falling softly across Briar Hill Cemetery again. But this time, the old dog finally slept through the storm. Over the following weeks, Ashcroft slowly became a different town. The investigation reopened by Deputy Nolan uncovered records, financial documents, and witness statements hidden for years inside Eleanor's tapes. Several officials connected to the illegal dumping near Miller's Creek quietly resigned before formal charges were even announced. But strangely, that was not what people in town talked about most anymore. They talked about Rusty. Every morning before work, residents began stopping by Briar Hill Cemetery carrying fresh flowers for Eleanor and treats for the old golden retriever who had refused to abandon her when everyone else did. Children started leaving handwritten notes near the grave thanking Rusty for being brave. Someone even painted a small wooden sign beside the cemetery entrance that read "The Dog Who Waited." Caleb stayed in Ashcroft far longer than he originally planned. At first, he told himself it was only to help Nolan organize Eleanor's tapes and records, but deep down he knew the real reason. Every evening, he found himself returning to the cemetery office just to check on Rusty. The old retriever had grown stronger after finally sleeping indoors and eating regularly again, yet he still followed the same quiet routine each day. Every sunrise, he walked slowly to Eleanor's grave. Every sunset, he returned to the small shelter beside Martha's office. But now the difference was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Rusty no longer watched the woods in fear. He no longer paced nervously or collected objects from around town. It was as if the constant tension inside him had finally loosened after years of carrying a secret no one understood. One chilly October afternoon, Caleb arrived at the cemetery carrying an old cassette player Nolan had repaired from Eleanor's shelter. Martha and several townspeople gathered quietly beneath the oak tree while Caleb inserted one of the tapes. Static crackled softly before Eleanor's voice filled the cold afternoon air for the first time in 7 years. She sounded calm, warm, and strangely hopeful despite everything she feared. Rusty immediately lifted his head the moment her voice echoed through the cemetery. Then something happened that made several people quietly wipe tears from their eyes. The old retriever slowly stood up and walked toward the cassette player with careful, uncertain steps, like he could not fully believe what he was hearing. Caleb watched as Rusty lowered himself beside the speaker and rested his chin gently against it, while Eleanor's voice continued telling stories about books she loved, rainy afternoons at the library, and a dog who used to sleep beside her desk while she worked late at night. For nearly an hour, Rusty did not move. He simply listened, the same way he must have listened to her years ago before the world turned cold and silent around him. When the tape finally clicked to an end, the cemetery remained completely quiet except for leaves rustling overhead. Rusty kept his head beside the speaker a few moments longer before slowly looking up toward Eleanor's grave. Then, for the first time since Caleb met him, the old retriever walked away from the headstone on his own before anyone called him. Not because he forgot her, not because he stopped caring, but because he no longer needed to guard her memory alone. Winter arrived early that year in Ashcroft. One morning after the season's first snowfall, Caleb opened the cemetery office door and found Rusty sleeping peacefully beside the heater with snowflakes melting softly across the windows behind him. The old retriever opened his eyes when Caleb entered, thumped his tail once against the floor, and calmly rested his head back down again. Safe at last. Some graves hold the dead. Others hold the truth until someone loyal enough refuses to leave.